The villagers often passed by the old cemetery with hushed whispers, their eyes darting toward one particular grave that seemed unlike the rest. Weathered headstones leaned into the earth, grass grew tall between the markers, and time had softened the sharp edges of grief carved in stone. But Clara's grave, Clara, who had died at only 23, was different. Her father, Thomas, visited her every morning without fail. No matter the season, he made the walk from his modest home at the edge of the village to the cemetery's iron gates. The air was always heavier there, carrying with it the scents of damp moss and fading flowers. For Thomas, each step along the gravel path was a ritual. He would pause at the small fountain near the entrance, dip his handkerchief into the water, and use it to wipe clean Clara's headstone. Then, with hands that still bore the roughness of years working as a carpenter, he placed fresh flowers, daisies, Clara's favorite, onto the mound. It was a father's devotion, an attempt to preserve dignity for a daughter taken too soon. Yet, in his visits, Thomas began to notice something that unsettled him deeply. Clara's grave was not staying level. At first, he dismissed it. Graves shifted sometimes, the soil settling after rain or frost. The caretaker himself had once told him it was normal. But as weeks passed, the change became undeniable. The earth upon Clara's resting place was rising, subtly at first, then more noticeably. By the third month, the grave looked less like a modest mound and more like a swelling hill compared to the others. Thomas's heart clenched whenever he saw it. He would kneel down, pressing his palm against the soil, feeling its strange looseness. His mind circled around explanations. Perhaps the coffin had shifted, or the grave had been filled incorrectly. Perhaps it was an animal. But why only Clara's grave? He tried to ignore the whispers of the villagers. They had begun to talk, as villagers always do. Some claimed the young woman's soul had been restless, unable to find peace. Others whispered of curses, of sins unconfessed. A few dared to suggest Clara had not truly died, that she had been buried alive, and now her spirit was fighting its way back to the surface. Thomas loathed such talk. Clara had been kind, full of laughter, always humming while she worked in the garden. She had fallen ill one winter, her breath failing, and no prayer nor doctor's hand had been able to save her. Thomas had carried her coffin himself, tears soaking into the wood as he lowered her into the earth. There was no curse, no unrest, only grief. Yet still, the grave grew. He turned to the priest, Father Bernard, who frowned but offered no true comfort. "The Lord works in mysteries, Thomas," he said gently, "and the earth is his creation. Sometimes it behaves in ways we cannot understand." But those words did nothing to soothe the gnawing fear inside him. He asked the caretaker, old Henry, a man who had tended the cemetery for decades. Henry swore he had done nothing unusual. "I've buried hundreds here," he rasped, leaning on his shovel. "I've seen graves sink, I've seen them crack. But rise. Like hers. Never." His eyes flickered uneasily toward Clara's plot. "It's not right." The days turned into nights of restless sleep. Thomas began dreaming of Clara, not as she was in life but as a pale figure reaching toward him from beneath the soil. Each morning, he awoke drenched in sweat, his chest tight. He began to dread his visits, yet he could not stop them. To stay away from her grave felt like betrayal. One evening, after a long day of work, Thomas sat alone at his table, staring at the flickering candlelight. His hands shook as he lifted a cup of water. He could no longer bear not knowing. The thought festered inside him like rot. What if something had happened to her body? What if someone had disturbed her rest? He had to see for himself, no matter the cost. That night, with the moon hidden behind a thick veil of clouds, Thomas slipped out of his home carrying a lantern and a spade. The village was quiet, the only sounds the distant hoot of an owl and the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. The cemetery gates groaned as he pushed them open, the sound echoing like a warning in the stillness. The lantern's glow cast long shadows across the headstones, stretching like skeletal fingers over the grass. Thomas's breath came in short bursts, each step heavier than the last. When he reached Clara's grave, he froze. In the dim light, the mound seemed larger than he had remembered even that morning. The earth was fresh, darker than the soil around it, as though it had been disturbed recently. His throat tightened. With trembling hands, he pressed the spade into the ground. The first strike sent a jolt up his arms. The soil gave way too easily, as though it had not settled properly. Each thrust of the spade filled him with both dread and determination. Sweat rolled down his temples despite the cool night air. He feared what he might uncover. A coffin broken open, a body missing, or worse, nothing at all. The digging went on, each clump of earth tossed aside with frantic energy. His lantern flickered with every movement, shadows dancing wildly around him. The grave seemed deeper than it should have been, the soil looser, layered strangely. His chest ached from exertion, but he pressed on. And then, the spade struck wood. The sound froze him in place. He dropped to his knees, brushing away the dirt with his hands, his breath ragged. The surface beneath was not smooth, polished coffin wood. Instead, it was rough, mismatched planks laid crudely together. His brow furrowed in confusion. This was not the coffin he had lowered into the ground months ago. Heart hammering, he pried the boards loose. Beneath them was a hollow, dark and strange, not a coffin but a cavity that did not belong. His lantern wavered as he peered inside. At first, he saw only shapes, bundles wrapped in cloth, odd items stacked haphazardly. His mind struggled to make sense of it. There were blankets, food wrapped in paper, even toys, a wooden horse, a doll with matted hair. The sight chilled him, for none of it belonged in a grave. And then, from the darkness, movement. A small form shifted, curling tighter. Two wide eyes reflected the lantern's light, staring up at him with a mixture of fear and longing. Thomas's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat, and the world seemed to tilt. It was not Clara. It was a child. Thin, pale, trembling, the child lay hidden among the strange supplies, as though buried yet alive. And then, with a voice so faint it was barely a whisper, the child spoke a single word that shattered Thomas's soul. Papa. Thomas froze, his body rooted to the soil as the fragile word hung in the night air. Papa. It cut through him like lightning, burning through grief, confusion, and fear all at once. His throat tightened, unable to form a response. The lantern trembled in his hand, casting shaky light over the child's hollowed face. The boy's cheeks were gaunt, his lips pale, yet his eyes, Clara's eyes, shone with startling familiarity. Thomas's spade slipped from his grasp and landed with a dull thud beside the grave. He reached down, hands trembling, as though he feared the child might vanish if he touched him. Who are you? He whispered, his voice breaking. The boy flinched at the sound, clutching the ragged blanket around his shoulders. His voice cracked like dry twigs when he answered. Papa told me to stay here, said no one would find me here. The words made no sense. Thomas's heart pounded violently, his mind racing. Clara had no children, she had died so young, with no husband, no life beyond their little home. And yet, this boy looked at him with such raw recognition, as if the very blood that ran in Thomas's veins lived in him as well. Who told you to stay? Thomas pressed, his voice low, urgent. The child hesitated, then whispered, Mama. Thomas staggered backward, his breath ripped from his chest. The soil beneath him seemed to tilt, the air pressing in too tightly. Clara. The name that had been his grief, his sorrow, his reason for coming here every day, Mama. No, Thomas murmured, his hands clutching his temples. Clara had been buried months ago. He had lowered her coffin himself. He had seen her face, pale and still, before they closed the lid. There was no way she could have left behind a child without him knowing. Yet the boy sat there, alive, hidden beneath her grave. He lifted the child into his arms, and the boy was feather-light, as if starvation had carved away his strength. The lantern's glow revealed faint bruises around his wrists, scars no child should bear. Thomas's heart broke anew. Whoever this child was, he had suffered, alone, in silence, beneath the soil meant for the dead. Thomas pulled the boy close. You're safe now, he whispered fiercely. I've got you. But as he carried the child away from the grave, questions clawed at him. Why had someone hidden the boy here? Why beneath Clara's name? And who was he really? The next morning, Thomas sought Father Bernard. The priest's eyes widened when Thomas placed the boy in front of him. Good heavens, he breathed. Where did you find him? In Clara's grave, Thomas replied, his voice hard, stripped of hesitation. Hidden there. Alive. Father Bernard paled, making the sign of the cross. This is blasphemy. Who would dare? I don't want prayers, Thomas snapped, his patience frayed by exhaustion and fear. I want the truth. Do you know this child? The priest studied the boy, then shook his head slowly. No. But Thomas, you must understand, the world is cruel. There are those who would use cemeteries, even graves, to hide things they wish unseen. Smugglers, outcasts, criminals. Thomas's stomach churned. To think of his Clarice resting place desecrated by such things made his blood boil. Yet when he looked at the boy, his anger faltered. The child wasn't an object smuggled or discarded. He was flesh and blood, terrified, fragile, clinging to Thomas as though he were the only safe place left in the world. Over the following days, Thomas struggled to piece together the truth. The boy, whose name, he learned, was Elias, spoke in fragments. He remembered a woman with soft hands and gentle humming, who had called herself Mama. He remembered being hidden away whenever men came to the house. He remembered fear, shadows, and finally being led into the earth, told to be quiet, told he would be safe. Thomas listened, heart aching. Could it be? Could Clara have borne a child in secret, away from his knowledge? He had never approved of the man she once loved, a drifter with a storm behind his eyes. They had quarreled about him bitterly before Clara's illness. Could she have hidden a pregnancy, ashamed, afraid? The timeline twisted painfully in his head. Clara had been ill for months. Was her frailty the sickness he thought it was, or the hidden weight of life within her? Had she given birth in secrecy, the shame too heavy to confess? And when she died, had someone, perhaps the man she once loved, decided to bury their child along with her memory, using her grave as a shield? The more Thomas thought of it, the more it burned. Clara had carried this secret alone, and now, her child had nearly been lost to the earth as well. One evening, as Thomas tucked Elias into a bed made from spare quilts, the boy looked up at him. "Papa?" he asked softly. Thomas's heart wavered. "Yes, my boy." Elias hesitated. "Will you leave me too? Like Mama?" The words tore Thomas apart. He brushed the boy's hair back gently. "Never," he said, voice thick. "You hear me? Never. I'll never leave you." And in that moment, something within him shifted. Elias was not just a mystery to be solved. He was a child who bore Clara's eyes, Clara's smile when it flickered through his fear. Whether he was Clara's son or not, he was now Thomas's responsibility. But peace did not come easily. The villagers soon learned of the discovery. Whispers spread like wildfire, of ghosts, of bastards, of curses that birthed children from the ground. Some said Thomas had gone mad, imagining things in his grief. Others eyed Elias with suspicion, muttering that no good would come from a child tied to the dead. Thomas endured their stares, their cruel gossip, for Elias's sake. He shielded the boy, working longer hours to provide for him, teaching him the ways of the carpentry shop. Slowly, Elias's cheeks filled, his laugh returned, and life began to carve itself anew in Thomas's home. Yet the grave still haunted him. He returned to it often, kneeling in silence. Clara's headstone seemed to watch over him, her name carved in stone, while her child lived in his care. One night, as the wind howled through the trees, Thomas whispered aloud to the grave. "Why didn't you tell me? Why hide him from me?" His voice broke, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I would have helped. I would have loved him." The silence of the cemetery gave no answer, only the rustle of leaves. Yet Thomas felt something stir within him, a release, a softening. Perhaps Clara had done what she thought was right, protecting her son in the only way she could. Perhaps her grave had grown not out of curse or restlessness, but out of love, sheltering the secret she could not entrust to anyone else. Thomas pressed his hand to the earth. "I've found him," he whispered. "And I'll keep him safe. I promise you." Years later, Elias grew into a strong young man under Thomas's care. He worked beside his grandfather in the carpentry shop, his laughter filling the home that had once been silent with grief. The villagers' whispers faded with time, replaced by respect for the bond between father and grandson. But Thomas never forgot the night he dug into Clara's grave, never forgot the shock of finding life where there should have been only death. The memory lived with him, a reminder that love does not end with burial, and that sometimes, the earth itself carries secrets meant to be uncovered by those strong enough to face them. And whenever Elias asked about his mother, Thomas would lead him to the cemetery, stand by Clara's grave, and tell him stories, of her kindness, her laughter, her favorite daisies. Elias would kneel, laying flowers as Thomas once had, his eyes soft with recognition of the woman he had never truly known. On one such day, Thomas watched his grandson place the flowers, and his heart swelled with both sorrow and joy. Clara's grave no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a bridge, a place where past and future met. He whispered into the breeze, "She still grows, Clara. Not the earth anymore, but through him. Through your son." And for the first time since her death, Thomas felt peace.